The presidential election of 1952, the first since the start of the Lavender Scare, made it a defining feature of the election. Republicans ran on the slogan, "Let's clean house." Richard Nixon ran against Democratic candidate Adlai Stevenson, who was unmarried and was a former State Department official. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover circulated false information that Stevenson had been arrested in New York for homosexual behavior. This rumor was repeated by Stevenson's ex-wife, who was clearly still angry at her ex-husband for the divorce. The credibility of the rumors against Stevenson were so thin that newspapers refused to report them. McCarthy, however, went on record and on television saying that he had created a file on Stevenson as a suspected gay man. The rumor that Stevenson was gay spread so pervasively that many gay people decided to vote for him, and the election of 1952 became about being either for or against homosexuality. When Dwight D. Eisenhower won the presidency, he was the first Republican in the White House in 20 years, thanks in large part to the Republican stance on the Lavender Scare. Eisenhower immediately issued Executive Order 10450 that called for the automatic firing of any federal employee displaying, quote, "any behavior which suggests the individual is not reliable or trustworthy," end quote. It specified, quote, "any criminal, infamous, dishonest, immoral, or notoriously disgraceful conduct, habitual use of intoxicants to excess, drug addiction, or sexual perversion," end quote. This was the first time sexual perversion was specifically stated as a reason all on its own for dismissal, without mentioning loyalty. As fear and paranoia spread, employees at the State Department began informing on their coworkers, sending along letters with hints and suggestions. Most of these were simply hunches, but the State Department ended up firing many of the people implicated. When the U.S. threatened to pull funding from the United Nations unless it fired gay employees, the Secretary General agreed, but only on the condition that the U.S. provide concrete evidence of homosexual activity rather than rumors or inclinations. Although the U.S. had no authority to provide suitability information to international organizations or to recommend action for those organizations, it continued to do so until 1972. In the following years, the U.S. worked with law enforcement agencies around the world to install programs to weed out gay employees. Although few countries in the West had anti-gay laws as strict as America's, they feared a cooling of their close ties with the U.S. if they didn't play along. Scotland Yard in England hosted American agents who helped them set up a gay detection unit. Allied nations feared that the U.S. would no longer share intelligence with them unless they demonstrated an ability and an inclination to purge gay employees from their governments. When Executive Order 10450 expanded the Lavender Scare from the State Department to the whole of the federal government, it included departments with no access to national security information, which begs the question, was the Lavender Scare really about national security or about finding an excuse to perform homophobia? Why, for instance, was the National Gallery of Art in Washington having to perform checks on its employees? Executive Order 10450 also gave government agencies the power of summary dismissal of employees without having to justify a documentable reason. This meant that an employee could be dismissed just for being gay, for being a security risk, without having already endangered national security. When the White House released its numbers for 1952 of how many dismissals they had gotten, the press asked for specifics. Why were they fired? For being communist? For being gay? For being gossips? The press continued to blast the White House for equating serious crimes like treason with minor offenses like drunkenness. They also pointed out that in going through the actual data, almost no one had been fired for communism, which was supposedly the whole point of the purge, meaning the White House was engaged in actual misinformation. Journalist Anthony Lewis of the New York Daily News pointed out that the government's tactics created an environment that allowed blackmail to flourish. When a young woman was dismissed for having extramarital sex with men, the press pointed out that people were now being dismissed for being too gay and for being too straight. By 1955, the public was largely calling for evidence of effectiveness and reasoning for the continued persecution of gay federal employees. It was becoming harder and harder to make a connection between homosexuality and national security. A study noted that it was becoming difficult to fill government positions, and that the general public sympathized with those who had lost jobs to the Lavendar Scare. By the end of the 1950s, the public consensus seemed to be that the Lavendar Scare had gone too far. But in September of 1960, two U.S. intelligence agents, Vernon F. Mitchell and William H. Martin, defected to the Soviet Union. When it came out that Martin had experimented with his sexuality as a teen, the press ran with it, announcing further evidence of the link between homosexuality, communism, and treason. It's important to note that the Hoey Committee and the general public still considered a single homosexual encounter to be evidence of homosexuality. Bisexuality was not well known, and the difference between sexual activity and sexual identity were not considered important at the time. This news story seemed to push the Lavendar Scare back 10 years to 1950. The newspapers ran much the same stories about a secret ring of homosexuals and the government secretly conspiring with the Soviet Union. One journalist wrote, quote, "Obviously, there is no all-out and effective campaign against homosexuals in the federal service," end quote. The Lavendar Scare became quieter, no longer publishing numbers of firings, but it continued. The tragedy of it, part of the tragedy of it, was that anyone dismissed from federal service was automatically assumed to be a communist or to be gay, which made them totally unemployable anywhere else, even if their firing had nothing to do with the Red or Lavendar Scares. The government's control reached beyond just federal service. Other jobs, even unrelated to government, were off limits. Almost any job that required a background check, such as any job working abroad, would flag people who had been fired from the federal government as security risks. The Lavendar Scare caused a massive economic crisis for the gay community in the U.S. But the crisis wasn't just economic. One State Department official noted with regret that the Lavendar Scare had killed a good number of Americans by so thoroughly ruining their lives that they took their own lives. The State Department began a campaign of misinformation to cover up the suicides they had caused, mentioning job strain and mental fitness in their statements to the press and to the families of their victims. There are examples of interrogating officials using coercive tactics such as blackmail to wrest confessions from suspects. One man was told by the State Department that they would tell his parents he was gay if he didn't confess to being gay right then. A few people, still figuring out their sexualities, were pushed along by the Lavendar Scare. One man claimed that if people this bad could think that being gay was bad, it was probably good. And he stopped hiding that part of himself. Unlike the Red Scare, the Lavendar Scare didn't publish the names of people it fired. That meant that homosexuality was a lurking specter without a face or humanity for much of the Lavendar Scare. The general public found it much easier to swallow because there weren't real people being affected by it within the public view. It's hard to calculate exactly how many people lost their jobs to the Lavendar Scare, because many people were recorded as having voluntarily resigned as a result of questioning. By the mid-1960s, the State Department had fired about 1,000 people for homosexuality, though that number's not exact. Because the State Department averaged about 1/5 of the total firings across government agencies, it can be assumed that about 5,000 people were fired or forced to resign because of their sexuality during the Lavendar Scare. It's hard to calculate how many people were affected by the Lavendar Scare because many resigned preemptively when the questioning started, and many more opted not to apply for government jobs in the first place out of fear. Many ex-service members who had been given blue or undesirable discharges during World War II thought that their plight was over, only to be confronted with the Lavendar Scare.